Hi, and welcome to AXSchat. Delighted to have Susanna Laurin from Funka with us today. Funka is an accessibility company based in Sweden. They do some fantastic work all over the world. Delighted to have you with us. I've been really interested in the stuff you've been doing, so I think we're going to have a really interesting chat today. Can you tell us a bit about how Funka came into being and what it is that your organization does?
We started out as a non-profit project, really, in the mid-90s. It was all of the Swedish disability organizations that came together wanting to develop a web portal for disabled people by disabled people. And that project was highly successful. After a couple of years, it was turned into a company. And since the year 2000, we have been working as a consultancy in accessibility and usability, both in the ICT domain and also in the built environment. And except for just the consultancy, we also do some research and innovation. And we are, of course, also working with standards and also some large strategic government assignments and so on. So we are doing more than just the ordinary consultancy.
Yeah, I know you do lots of research because I've been reading your papers, particularly interested in the stuff around cognitive accessibility that you've done. Google Translate didn't do a bad job on it.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that.
Swedish, but it's interesting stuff, and it's particularly of interest to me being dyslexic. So I think one of the things we talked about as an interesting discussion topic was the idea of text and non-text. The accessibility world spends a lot of time adding text to describe images,
yes,
which is great and really important for people who are blind, but actually a lot more people struggle with text than with images. So you've been talking about work you're doing around maybe we should be looking at adding more images rather than just text. So can you tell us a bit more about the work you've been doing in that sphere?
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that most people that start reading WCAG, they get tired after the first guideline, and the first guideline has to do with text alternative, and there's no equivalent that says that a text should also have a non-text alternative. There's no one is talking about that, but that should really be the case. And we have done research together with different usability or disability organizations and different end-user groups with cognitive disabilities and also people with sign language as their maternal language and so on, and really looking into what they prefer and how they can perceive information in the best way. And it doesn't matter how much you work with the text. According to our research, we can only get around 50 to 60% of the users to really understand the text and answer controlled questions on the text, no matter how much we work with the text. And we have certified language specialists that can do really easy to read things. But if you add pictures or illustrations or films, you can get another 20 to 30% of the users to really understand the content. And if you then add sound as well, synthetic sound, you can have another 8 to 10% of the users really understanding the content. So there's a lot to be done there, and still, at least in public sector, in the European countries where we work, most of public sector websites are 95% text, and that is a real problem.
Yes, that's actually a huge step up. You know, 20-30% increase in numbers of able to access information is a massive leap forward. So I'm quite surprised that there hasn't been more greater uptake of this.
There are things happening, but I still think that at least among our customers, most of the people that work with information and communication, they are text people. Yes. So anytime they want to inform or communicate on something, they just jump on the keyboard and they start writing. And I'm a part of that problem myself. I'm a writing and reading person, so I love to write and I love to read. And that means that every time I'm trying to communicate something, I'm writing a long text. And you really need to sort of a change of mindset to work with pictures instead. And I'm not good at drawing, so to me it has been a big step for me as well, just to try to think, how am I going to communicate this in the best way? Sometimes text is the best way. but often it's not. And really, you need to have good people around you working with photos and illustrations and graphs and films and things like that. And not all of our clients have that. So I think it will take some time before they can sort of, I don't mean to be rude, but get rid of some of the text people
Yeah.
and bring on some image people instead, and not believing that it has to be a Hollywood production as soon as you talk about moving pictures. It could be really a very easy video, just filming with your smartphone or something. But it's a long step for them to understand that it doesn't need to have the perfect quality of the video to be a good message.
We're great believers in that here at AXSchat.
I know, but you're not public sector in Europe.
No. I appreciate that too. I think it's interesting, and I know that there's a crossover between that particular research and also some of the work that's being done in places like the Mada Center in Qatar, where they're looking
Yep.
at symbols. And I know a friend of mine, E.A. Draffen, is doing a lot of work on symbols. And one of the issues that you have with symbols is actually working out and sort of pictorial representation is that just like written language, symbols mean different things in in different cultures.
Yeah.
So trying to actually find symbols that translate across borders is particularly challenging.
Yeah.
So,
And until now, we haven't seen many icons that really does the job. I mean, it's like the save icon on a computer. Most people understand what that is, but today nobody under 30 has ever seen the floppy disk. So it's a funny thing. The power of the icon is not how well it represents the real thing. It is the way you recognize it and that people have experience from it. That is the power of the icon. And we have done lots of user testing also with the hamburger icon, the menu navigation icon that are widely used in responsive design on smartphones. And there are huge numbers of users that still do not know what it means. So our recommendation is always to use an icon that is good, but also in combination with text.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
They make quite good coffee mug coasters.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they're useful for these days. I think I've still got boxes of them. Um, I think the other thing with symbols as well is we were looking at this for the Cognitive Accessibility Task Force, which I'm part of for W3C, and trying to look at symbols that mean stuff to people.
Mm-hmm.
The save menu is an obvious one in terms of it's anachronistic, but everyone knows what it is. The other thing is that frustrates me greatly is hidden UI elements. We're taking more and more things off screen to create real estate on the screen for you to display pictures and stuff. But if it's not there, people don't necessarily know that they can interact with stuff. So how do we actually convey to users, especially new users or people that are older and haven't got the experience and don't have the same kind of culture of experimentation as younger people, how do we get them familiar with the interface? Because I think that's a fundamental UX accessibility crossover issue where if you can't perceive it, you can't use it.
No. And I think we need to recognize that many users, probably more than we think of, and absolutely not only disabled people, do need time to accommodate to new things. And it's not only about the care for users or users that are not feeling comfortable with new things, but every one of us. I mean, just now I needed to borrow somebody else's computer to do this interview, and I feel completely lost because I don't recognize anything on the computer. I mean, it's very easy. I work with computers every day. I don't believe I'm the lousiest user in the world, but still, when I'm with a new interface, I feel completely lost and with a little bit of stress because now Neil is wanting to call me. Then that makes the cognitive overload so great, so I barely couldn't start the computer. I mean, that's just an example of how we are really forcing users to do very, very difficult things today. And we must understand that not everyone is technically interested or feeling comfortable with all these new things. And I think when we start doing a lot of new, sexy, stylish things in the interface, a lot of users are having barriers to understand this. And it takes much longer than I think the trendy UX people understand to get everyone on board.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's very common, that if you don't feel comfortable in what you're doing, or if you're not really sure of what you're doing, I mean, I wouldn't press a button when it has to do with money if I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I think it's very natural that we are reluctant to do things that we don't really understand what will happen when I click here. I mean, it's I think the most common thing would be not to try. I think there is a minority that really tries everything, and it's good for them. But we are many people that don't act like that. As long, I mean, maybe if we're just playing around with something, but when it has to do with my own computer and my money and my security, then we are a bit careful, and I think that's a good thing as well.
I think it's quite interesting because I've seen things go backwards and forwards and take a leap forward and then go backwards again as people have banking in particular with the concerns over security have added layer upon layer of complexity,
Yeah.
layer upon layer of cognitive load on users. And I've seen it go from my parents being able to transfer money to going back to writing checks.
Yeah.
Because the payoff just wasn't great enough.
No.
In terms of they don't really care if the money's going to arrive in 3 days' time. It's much easier just to write something and put it in the post than
Yeah.
have to deal with stuff timing out and remembering passwords and challenge and response and all of these things, and finding the book where you've written your passwords insecurely and all of the rest of the stuff that older people do.
Not only older
No,
people.
I know, but I'm feeling pretty smug. I've got them both with password safes now, so.
Okay, good on you. But I
Don't
think
blame me.
that's true, and it also has to do with the amount of services that we need to do on our own. I mean, it started out, at least here, it started out with the banks. So
Yeah.
many people went on and tried to, I mean, we could do the tax declaration things and we could do the banking. That was actually two things that we could do, and people saw something positive. It was easy to do. You could do it in the weekends or in the evenings, and that was a good service. But now you need to do everything yourself, and you have thousands of passwords and thousands of different interfaces, and it just gets too much. So I think it's a cognitive overload, not only from the banks being more complex, because I agree the service is getting more complex, but it's also that there are so many different things that we are supposed to do on our own without help. And for me, I have the world's best ICT service support. I mean, the nicest persons in the world that run everywhere and do everything for me. But I mean, like my parents, they don't. They can just call me, and I'm a complete idiot. So I'm just happy if I can help them with anything. So I mean, for people that do not work in an area where they get a lot of ICT support in their workspace, I mean, most people are completely lost in this new world. Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's not a great deal of consistency between
No.
these different things, and to a certain extent, we understand. We live in a capitalist society where they're trying to differentiate their services to a certain extent, but equally, having greater standardization would make life a lot easier.
Absolutely. And I mean, in verification and authentication and things like that, I think we could have much more standardized services, and then the banks or whatever could compete with each other with the services. But we don't need to identify ourselves in 25 different ways. I mean, that could be standardized. I guess that also would be more secure.
I hope so. I know that the UK government are looking at syndicating out standardized verification.
Yeah.
So it's gov.uk verify, I think, is what they're working on right now,
Yeah.
for things like tax purposes, etc. I've yet to see how easy it is. Personally, as someone that's dyslexic, I have a real problem with passwords and numbers and sequences and everything else. I'm locking myself out all the time. So I'm looking forward to the day where two-factor authentication, maybe two lots of biometric things, face, thumb, hopefully they won't have cut my head off and my thumb to get access to my bank account. So
Yeah.
we should be good. But so the technology is almost there, but the adoption is actually lagging quite significantly behind. I've got a fingerprint reader on my PC for work, but it's not enabled. I work I work for a large company. We've got 100,000 employees, so things move quite slowly. But the technology has been built into the laptops for many years. It would be great to be able to use that rather than me phoning up the service desk on a weekly basis saying, "Hello, I've locked myself out again."
I think all of this has to do with society looking at accessibility and usability as something completely different from e-government or security or verification. I mean, there's a lot of clever people working with these things of how to authorize people and do identification, but they are, at least where we work, they are rarely even close to people that have experience and knowledge about accessibility and usability. So these different areas seem not to mix, which is very bad for all of us, because this will just go on and be more and more complex, I think, and more problematic for users to be actually able to use the technology.
So I think that even accessibility and usability people are, to a certain extent, siloed. So how do you think we can remove some of these artificial walls?
The artificial walls between accessibility and usability, or between...
Yes,
Yeah.
I think those are the easiest ones. I would say they're artificial. Some of the ones between the security guys and the accessibility people, they're probably more real.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe, but I also think it has to do with that we are very stuck in our own way of looking into things. I think it has to do with communication. If we put some clever security people and some clever accessibility people in the same room for a while and gave them coffee and food, maybe, then I am sure they could solve at least some of the problems. But accessibility and usability, I think the border is sort of being more and more loose, at least in Northern Europe. And we see that many of the usability companies are also sort of coming closer into our areas, and we are definitely nagging on them to be able to let us in their areas. I think it has more to do with language and the way we sell our services, the way we communicate around what we're doing, because none of our clients ever complained about or questioned that we are talking about accessibility and usability in the same time. And to me, I think, again, it has to do with regulation and the way we look at the standards, because WCAG, in our point of view, is so technical and has so much to do with assistive technology that you tend to, or some people tend to forget that it has all of the soft things and the human things and the cognitive things, issues around it. And when you see accessibility in a broader perspective, having to do with people more than having to do with WCAG, then usability and accessibility really is the same thing. There is no border between it, because it's just two ways of looking at absolutely the same thing.
Yeah.
So,
I'm part of WCAG. I'm part of the working group, and I have a love-hate relationship with it.
yeah.
I love the intention. I hate the execution. It's very technocratic, and also people only implement the stuff that makes it work with assistive tech. All of the personal, the human stuff tends to be the stuff that people find really hard.
Yeah.
They have difficulty grasping the idea that something's not necessarily 100% machine testable. And I think that brings me nicely on to another thing that I'd like to talk about, and that's automatic versus manual.
Yeah, that's a Pandora's box. So. Well, we have been working the last year for the European Commission on an assignment trying to make recommendations that has to do with monitoring web accessibility in the European member states, because when I don't think it's an if, I think it's a when the web directive will come into force, then it should be, yes. But I think, I mean, the Commission is crazy in many ways, but they do not give away money so easily. I don't think they would have given us this assignment if they didn't firmly believe that this web directive will come into force. So I do believe it will be there. We don't know exactly how it will be, what it will cover, but in some way or another, I'm sure there will be legislation on web accessibility, at least for public sector in Europe, in a year or two. And then we have a very exciting and difficult assignment to collect all the monitoring methodologies around in the member states today and validate them and see how they actually work, and see if they are reliable, and see if we can learn something from the monitoring methodologies around there today, how they are used and what they can actually cover. And then to come up with recommendations to the Commission on how to monitor compliance of the upcoming web directive. And we only have a month to go before we should have the last report written. So we really need to do the thinking now, because now we have been working a lot with the analysis and collections and all of that, and also working with advisory boards and national correspondence. But now we have to come up with a really clever thinking. But what we have seen is that automatic testing can, of course, do many things, but they are, it's a huge gap between what all the automatic tools that we have been trying out, what they can measure and what a good manual testing can actually measure. But we have also seen manual testing result that has been very bad. So manual testing isn't the answer as such. It needs to be manual testing with a very clear and structured methodology, where it really says how are you going to measure things and how are you going to monitor, and how are you interpreting the different things that you are actually measuring. Otherwise, manual testing is just a guesswork. And also, of course, some of the things in the automatic testing tools are very interesting. For example, in Holland, they are doing very large scale automatic testing. And even if the results are not very reliable, they do see some things. For example, they see very clearly that some specific content management systems are having specific problems. And because of how the market looks in the Netherlands, they could then go to this specific supplier and say, we are procuring for all of the public sector, and if you want, or if you're willing to fix the accessibility problems, then you will get all of these clients. And I mean, you can do a very direct procurement and having a fantastic possibility to really change the market the technical parts of the accessibility market. And nobody would have been able to detect that possibility if they hadn't done this very large scale testing. And of course you can't do that if you don't have an unlimited resource, which no one has. Then you can't do that many tests manually. And I think even if we had done all of these tests, we probably would have been lost in the big data that we have collected.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you've got patterns emerging.
Yeah, exactly.
And
So the automatic testing has some really interesting positive effects as well, and you can really, but you need to use it in a good way. And I think what we have really learned, what was really clear from this research, is that there is a large difference, and this is very important, between monitoring on a large scale to be able to sort of compare Greece with Bulgaria. Whoever thinks that's interesting, and it's a completely different thing to say, hey, Neil, your website is not accessible and you need to fix this and that, because that is more measuring or auditing your website, and that needs to be done in a qualitative way. Whereas if you just want to see sort of the trend in different countries, then maybe it's sort of good enough to do some automatic testing, as long as you don't believe that this is really accessibility testing. This is testing for compliance, and you can just do small parts of it, and they are not 100% reliable. So don't use it for measuring and trying to sort of teach the website owners or suppliers how to work with accessibility, because that will completely fail.
okay,
You need to detect, to separate these two ideas. And most countries we have, where we have tested monitoring methodologies, they try to do both, and that is extremely difficult.
And you're going to need armies of testers.
Yes, but that's good. Let's have an army of accessibility professionals. That would be fine, because I mean we need them anyway. So
Well, we do, and it's one of the reasons we set up an academy scheme in our organisation, because we recognise that we need to encourage a new generation of accessibility people.
But if I can just conclude on the monitoring methodology thing, because that's what my head is full of now, is that I hope one of our recommendations will be to try to combine manual testing with some sort of training, because there are some countries that have been trying to do this, and even if their methodologies are not perfect, I think you can learn something very interesting from there. You need to make the monitoring in another way, but really combine having the website owners to maybe doing self-declarations or self-assessments in a way that you do train them in accessibility in the same time. So they can't really answer the questions without going through a lot of training. And that way you can really achieve something, not only I don't mean wasting, but not only use the money on monitoring, because we all know that we have problems, so who cares about the problems? I mean, why do we monitor? Why do we use a lot of money on this? The most interesting way to use the resources of taxpayers' money would be to actually do something, make something that is better.
And upskill people. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So just don't just audit things and sort of present the problems, solve the problems instead. That would be the most important recommendation for the Commission, to use the money in a wise way.
And of course, what we want to be doing is comparing apples with apples. So having a standardized testing methodology is really important, so that we can look across different nations and look at and see those patterns.
Because but why do we? I mean, how are we going to use that? I understand that the Commission wants to compare, but really we already know that the Southern European countries and the Eastern European countries that are hit by the economic crisis, that they have a generally lower accessibility than the Scandinavian countries or the UK. So why do we need to measure that every year?
No, I don't think you need to measure for point scoring purposes. I think you need to measure for pattern recognition.
Yeah.
For seeing trends and seeing where you can make a difference by doing things like leveraging procurement power. And actually, I'm really pleased to hear that the Netherlands are doing it. We're also doing it with business in the UK.
Yeah.
So we're clubbing together and we're approaching large organisations that have a reputation for not being great with accessible products, and beginning to have conversations collectively and saying, we're your customer base. We understand that stuff's not particularly accessible now. We understand that you're not going to fix the old stuff, but we want to work with you to make the new stuff much better.
Yeah.
And that's beginning to pay off, and we're starting to have those discussions at a sensible level and with really large organisations. So I think that it has value in that sense, absolutely, to measure and compare, because then you can see the trends. Antonio,
as long as the well-performing countries don't think that they can be lazy cats and just wait until Bulgaria is coming side by side with us, because that is also what could be happening, and that is why we are a bit skeptic to all of this, because we think that the Scandinavian countries being the forerunners now.
Oh, you rest on your laurels.
Yeah, that could be the case. So that's also another thing. How can you compare and measure and have the same compliance level, but still sort of push for innovation and push the well-performing countries to keep on pushing, keep on doing things? That is good.
Antonio, you had a question?
I think one of the key issues here is to try to convince that the universities should have accessibility training in the curriculum. I mean, that would be one way of ensuring that designers and developers and everyone that is working with technology has some idea of accessibility, at least when they get out of university. I think that would move a lot of things, and we are still not there. We are trying in the countries where we are working, but none has really done this on a large scale, unfortunately. So I think that could change a lot. And I also believe that in some areas and regions and also on nationwide, there are competitions like hackathons and innovation competitions that can give money to startups or smaller SMEs, and just for doing sort of good things for accessibility and usability. And that could be one way of trying to get people to look into this field. And I've been in the jury of several of these competitions, and I think it's very easy for young people that are usually, if I can generalize, very sort of concerned about the environment and about refugee situation and all of this. It's very easy, as long as they get awareness around accessibility issues, they really want to do the best thing they can. So I really believe we just need to stop talking to ourselves and start communicating to the rest of the world.
Yes.
And then all of these young people working with technology could really do a great difference. But I think it's just ignorance, that they have no idea that this problem exists, and that's why they don't solve it.
No, because at 18 you're immortal.
Yeah.
Okay, so one last topic I'd really like to get in before we close, and I'm happy to overrun slightly, is the idea of getting end user involvement in standardization, because this sounds really interesting to me.
Yeah.
What do you mean by end user involvement in standardization? Because from my experience, writing standards is not something that end users would find very friendly.
Well, I haven't yet met anyone thinking that writing standards is a nice thing to do. You usually say that it's a good way to lose friends and put family asleep. So standardization is a hassle, even if it's important.
Yeah.
But we have been working with especially people with cognitive disabilities to ensure that this group can also have a say when we work with the ISO standards. We are trying to put cognitive accessibility in the sort of limelight, and that way we think it's important to also work with end users. And we have an industry PhD on the Technical Royal University in Stockholm, working especially with researching on cognitive disabilities, and we have lots of persons with cognitive disabilities that we can use is maybe not the right word, but sort of work together with in these issues. And we have been trying to softly teach them a little bit about standardization and working with them on smaller parts, picking out small questions and saying, this is what are we going to discuss this day. And then we have been using hours and hours and hours, and we have done short meetings, and they have been gone home resting, and we have done another short meeting, and we have been trying to just collect parts of the standards where we think that could be interesting to discuss. And then we have actually had the last time when there was an ISO meeting in, I believe it was in Japan, so it was in the middle of the night in Sweden, but we got people really engaged, and the standardization group could send questions to our panel of people with cognitive disabilities in Sweden, and they had discussions, and then they came back with answers. So it has really been a real live interaction, but of course driven by the fact that we have this group where we can work together, and that they feel comfortable in that their way of communicating is sort of translated in a good way, because not many of them speak English, so there's a there are many hurdles or barriers on the way. But it's very rewarding to do this kind of work, and I think we have been doing things with these standards that have never been done before, and the other experts are extremely interested, and we have had visitors from all over the world just looking into this research that we are doing. So I believe we're onto something really big here, and we would really like this to be a way of doing things with end users that can be used in many other ways, because it's not only about inviting the organizations, it's about inviting individuals. That is also a very important note to understand, that the organizations, they have a political idea, and that's very important, and they need to be able to present that, of course. But just that, like the industry organizations sometimes are very hard to work with in standardization, because they tend to say no to everything. End user organizations can also be difficult when they are only sort of driving the political wills, because then they tend not to listen to reason or other user groups. So having individuals that work with the standards that are not part of the organizations, that can be much more rewarding, because they can sometimes be much more open. And at least in Northern Europe, the end-user organizations are losing members. Normally, I think in Scandinavia at least, around 10% of the target groups are actually members and active in the organizations now, and 90% are outside of the organizations. So, and that is, of course, sometimes a problem, because they lose momentum. But it's also very important to understand that when you talk to the organizations, you talk to an organization that has an agenda. And that is not always for the common good of a standard, which needs to be consensus-based.
No, I agree. A lot of these organizations are also paid to play, and
Exactly.
people are paying for a reason.
Yes. And there's another thing we're trying to do in Scandinavia, which I think is very important, and that is to make the industry, everyone that is working with end users, to understand that end users need to be paid for their work. And we're trying to write up a charter or a document for all the big industry, everyone working with usability or accessibility or anything, but anyone that is working with end users, that the end users are going to be paid. And we want to have a standardized way of doing that, so that, I mean, you're welcome to pay more, but at least you should pay this amount, because many people with disabilities don't want to do testing because they are not paid. They are not acknowledged. They are not acknowledged. They are not. They are treated very badly. And also, what we have found when we are talking to end users is that one of the things they tend to dislike with participating in user tests is that they give a lot of information, and they are creative and doing a lot of things in this project, and then everything disappears and they never hear from it again. So just having feedback, this is what the end result was, presented in a way that you can understand. If it's a very complicated research report, then maybe do a summary, so that the people that fed into this report understand what did we really, what is the result here, what did we conclude from this, so that you get feedback. That's another very important thing. So we try to change the whole way that the industry is working with end users. We're still having a long way to go, but we are slowly getting more and more interest in the work we are doing. I think it's time that the end users get the payback.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I've been working with end users too, doing quite a lot of interviews for some of the research we've been doing for cognitive accessibility for W3C, and particularly around areas which are less understood, like dyscalculia. There's such a lack of research that best way of finding out what works is to actually go and ask people.
Yeah.
Um, we're well over our half hour. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Can't wait to get you on Twitter this evening. Thank you very much, Susanna.
Thank you.
Bye bye.